which is really talking about how capital now needs to move beyond the idea of public-private partnerships and to be promoting private provision of social infrastructure openly and directly rather than hiding it behind arrangements of public-private partnerships. I'll come back to that. Now, it's true that a lot of our current social physical infrastructure, from communications to education to health to energy, is already significantly privately provided, if often with public support. So the bigger danger, I think, than the PPPs, meaning public-private partnerships, is that we do move towards more purely private provision. Now, it's worth thinking about this for a while. We live in a time and a place where economic incentives, and the twin of the word incentive is the word risk, are regarded as primarily something which is best understood at the level of individuals or their corporate avatars, which after all is what a company is. It's an avatar for individuals. Now, it might seem obvious that when it comes to social infrastructure or public infrastructure, both those twins are themselves best socially identified, understood and managed. But we still often like to adopt or impose that private model, privatising our thinking, if you like. And that doesn't make the social risk go away. It means that the private interest, the private incentive is prioritised over the social incentive. And we discover to our cost, of course, that when private interest investment considers something to be external, it turns out not, of course, to be external. The externalities are socially internal. Now, it was common in my younger days, which was a fair while ago, of course, for people to seriously refer to this country, and again, it's worth remembering, it was often referred to as having what was called a mixed economy, and to do so with a straight face. The reality was never quite how it was portrayed, neither here nor in other comparable countries. But in that period, it was at least polite to pretend that there was some kind of just right mixed economy, a just right temperature of the economic porridge, which could mix social and private interest-driven economic incentives together to a common benefit. That was, if you like, one of the core myths of New Zealand of the 50s and 60s. There were those who never believed that on either side of the fence. The ideological battle between those views, frankly, was won by those who believed that private interest-driven economic incentive was inherently superior. That didn't make those who believed the opposite wrong. It didn't mean that they had lost the war, but it's important we recognise that we had lost an important battle. Now, that's all quite familiar history at one level, but the resultant degradation of social interest economic capacity continues today and is gathering pace. It may even have further to go, in my guess, before revulsion turns the tide. So this is a tough time for those who bear the brunt of that degradation, and it's also tough for those who want to promote the alternative. You can see several forms of this privatisation of private interest investment in action. It's not new, it's a continuation and refinement of the shifts which have occurred over the last half century. And I think it's important for us too to recognise that while there have been some disruptions to that, the disruptions were largely resting places rather than reversals. Very seldom has this tide been actually turned back. There have been resting places, but very few reversals. So the arc of history in this respect has trended and still does trend towards the primacy of private economic interests. An important aspect of that is that it's seldom, when you think about it, it's seldom been an actual replacement of social with private interest actions driven by the social acceptance of clearly superior outcomes from private interest investment. In almost all cases, the replacement has been imposed by governments with an ideological bias in favour of those private interests, not on an evidence base or not on a clearly demonstrated superior outcome. It's quite extraordinary when you think about it, the level of change that there has been, where so much of the change has been imposed by governments of various ideological frameworks. The interesting thing about that is, of course, if you think about capitalism, it's hardly the robust competition of what might be seen as creative disruption or replacement of one form or another because it outperforms it in some way. What we typically find is that the ongoing risk actually is not disappeared, it's shared or more likely still held by the social interest, while the returns flow to the private interest. So the slogans are about private interest superiority based on incentives and processes, and the reality is about rewarding cronies and the masters of capital, not outcomes at all. So you can see why Karl Marx, and this will wake Robert Reed up, you can see then why Karl Marx labelled the state as the executive committee of the ruling class. If you think about that characterisation, isn't it somewhat strange that progressives so often look to the state or the government, to its control and ownership of things, as a universally benign or progressive force, despite it being so obviously not that at all in so many cases and in so many ways in our own history, where the state has imposed these changes. So state or government can be benign or progressive, but whether it is or not really depends on the state of the social and economic power at the time. In other words, it depends on who is the master. So that, I think, is why we find that despite much privatisation in economies, including our own, the apparent size of the public or social or government share of the economy actually doesn't fall all that much. Now, why is that? Well, so often the public or social interest is still paying most or all of the costs of economic activities. Health is a great example of that. We have a largely private health system that we call a public health system because the public pays for the private health system to operate. Much of the delivery is through private interests earning profit on the spend of the public interest. So I draw attention to that context, and I will get to public-private partnerships in a minute. But the context is important, I think, because this specific form of privatisation that we call public-private partnership is really simply another form of the privatisation that sits alongside asset sales, much current government commissioning and funding, engagement of private consulting firms, design and other professional services, construction, the list goes on. Now, private interests or their political acolytes often claim that they're supporting the social interest, but the reality is very often the reverse of that. And when you think about it, that was true also at the very start of our welfare state. The building of state houses, which we love, was the birth of the Fletcher Empire as much as it was the birth of any working class salvation or public interest promotion. Not to make it wrong, but to recognise what was actually happening. And I think we should note also that private interests include capital asset funds which may well be sovereign or some other public savings-based nature. That doesn't call it KiwiSaver accounts, if you like, or government superannuation funds. That doesn't stop those from being or acting as private capital, be they local or global. They follow, once they accumulate the capital, exactly the same logic and processes. Capital is capital. No matter how or where it was created, it doesn't behave differently. Similarly, I think we're wise to be careful about a preference for local as opposed to overseas capital, which is something we love to do. We haven't invented a new kind of capital in Aotearoa, I regret to tell you. The idea that such capital, which is embedded in state-sponsored private savings schemes, is somehow likely to have a different inherent behaviour to that under some other control, I think is purely an illusion. Capital has its own logic of growth, and it's not easily dissuaded from following it. Just because something has a public source doesn't mean that it escapes that logic. So in our enthusiasm for having public or state control of things, we should remember that who controls the state is just as important as what the state controls. The public-private partnership idea is, of course, not indigenous to Aotearoa. It's taken different forms at different times and locations. A treasury definition is that of an arrangement between a public entity and a private company for delivering public services or infrastructure, which isn't really all that helpful because it describes almost everything that happens in the New Zealand economy. You will see that that's a very wide range, and for this purpose I want to treat a private-public partnership as relating to public infrastructure being financed and jointly controlled by a private interest entity by agreement with the government. It's not quite the Treasury definition, but I think it's more what people normally mean by public-private partnership. Now, it's true that very often in PPP arrangements, the finance role has a direct connection with the delivery role in a consortium or partnership on the private side itself. And when you think about it again, the reality is that in Aotearoa, any significant infrastructure project will be delivered by a private interest entity. There aren't any others. You've got to remember that. There are no alternatives. There is no public capacity to do a lot of the things that we're proposing to do. There may have been, but there isn't as things stand. So whether it's local or offshore, it will be a private construction entity which delivers the actual work, or much more likely organises the work, to be done by a collection of smaller local contractors and their staff, or some from overseas, for example, by something like tunnelling. It is useful in our heads to distinguish between those two roles of financing and delivery. The delivery issue is harder to replace. There are competencies for specific large projects like tunnels or bridge building or whatever you might be that we don't have in either private or social ownership here. Now, we may be able to build some capability up over time, and I like the idea that the Green Party were talking about last week of trying to start to rebuild some of that capacity, and I'll come back to that. But at the present time, our ability to do that for our social infrastructure projects is questionable or absent. So we will need in some form to be contracting with private interest construction capability. But that doesn't mean that it has to take a PPP form. There are many examples of PPPs around the world, and if on most any of the objective reviews about them, the projects have had pretty mixed outcomes. You can exaggerate the total extent of such arrangements. A recent Citibank study noted that in the US, for example, where people talk a lot about public-private partnerships, only something between 1% and 3% of water and transport projects in the 3 decades up to 2020 was actually in the form of a PPP. So despite people advocating for them for here as if everyone uses them, in fact they're a relatively small proportion, slightly larger in the UK and slightly worse in the UK in terms of their outcomes. Notwithstanding all of that, there is tremendous interest at the moment amongst major asset managers, both public and private around the world, to enter this space. There's a plethora of reports flooding out of them at the moment. Now, if you just observed Aotearoa as its own place, you might think that there was this clever government, they would like you to think this clever government that was thinking of options for New Zealand and thought, gee, these private-public partnerships are a great idea, let's see what we can do. The truth is that the pressure is coming entirely from the other side, from the holders of capital, the asset managers of capital who want these things. And the promotion of those arrangements just recognises that they see opportunity in public agencies' inability or unwillingness to finance the demands on their own balance sheets. We're not alone in this. All around the world, businesses and governments are doing the same thing. Now that in itself should give us some pause. The private interests are looking for opportunity to profit with some degree of public risk to underwrite as much as they can get. Where they find pliant politicians, they will get active. But note that to get their involvement, we need to offer better risk-adjusted returns than they can get elsewhere, recognising that there isn't anything more mobile in the world than capital. So these are really dangerous waters. Just as we do with some other things, we are involving ourselves in some kind of a race to the bottom in terms of tax concessions, for example, which we favoured in relation to some other industries. It's the same process which will go on. You have the capital wanting to invest, you have it scouring the world looking for opportunities, and where they can find pliant politicians, which you would think wouldn't be too hard to find here at the moment, that is where they will strike. So some of those gains, I think, are going to be highly illusory. But we have to understand what the market for PPPs is. If we're naive about that, we'll be in deep trouble, and we are being naive about it. It's not a matter of being open for business, but of being open to special favours for specific private interest investment interests. That's entirely what this game is about. And we need to remember that that is what we're entering into. Now, our friends at Treasury will tell us that such PPPs, and I quote from them again, I might be one of the few people that reads Treasury reports, actually. Pretty sure the Minister of Finance doesn't. They say that the PPPs aim to leverage the efficiency and expertise of the private sector to deliver projects that might be difficult or costly for the public sector to manage alone. Poor old public sector. Now, it is true that in the absence of large-scale infrastructure projects expertise in our public sector, that private interests with experience and expertise might be needed in some things. But as Treasury has also recognised, access to that does not depend on joint projects, but may be simply contracted. The desire from capable private asset managers for joint projects is to enhance their earnings potential through shared control of project design and risk shifting, bringing capital and control together for one purpose, their purpose. So financing is at the heart of PPPs, whatever the cosmetic presentation might be about risk sharing, it's risk shifting. So you could ask yourself, is private investment interest financing cheaper? Well, frankly, it's highly unlikely that any private interest partner has either debt or expected equity return costs lower than the government. So this possibility can be readily dismissed as a matter of economics. And where the politicians shifted is that while that is true, and they know it's true as a matter of economics, in accounting terms, a PPP arrangement may be able to shift the financing from one balance sheet to another, or shift it over time by not paying for it now but charging fees to use the infrastructure once it's built over time. But the economic benefit of it is frankly nil, in fact negative. Now, it's true also that there are potentially design and management capability advantages from private interest parties. But when you think about it too, that's as much a danger as it is an advantage. When you have asymmetry of capability in contracting, it always skews contracting benefits to the stronger party. Funny that, amazing people didn't think about it. And it escalates transaction costs in the process. Now that can be counteracted in some competitive conditions where the government is strong or a sole contracting partner, but it's far more likely that it's the weaker partner. And when you've declared that you don't have the money to do things, but you need to do things and you want help, you are the weaker partner. The issue with the profit incentive is not that it doesn't work, but that it does. It works for the party that has the profit incentive, not for the others. So the danger we face now is that what gets built in terms of infrastructure is not only going to not be less costly nor more efficient, but two things are going to happen. First, it'll cost more because of the higher debt and equity requirements than purely government funding. And secondly, it takes the risk that the timing, design, operational process, and even the choice of projects will be driven by private rather than social interests. And the choice of projects is really important, because if you're short of money, you want to do things, you will do the ones that the private interest will finance, will obviously get preference over the ones that it will not finance because you can't afford it. Now, Craig Rennie, who I think is speaking next to the Fabian side, he's done some excellent work on this, and I won't go into any more detail, because if you want to follow through on some of the pros and cons of specific private partnerships, public-private partnerships, Craig's written some really good stuff on it in the CTU, on his own blogs and things, but also in CTU publications. he describes the risks very well and how likely they are. Now, none of that means that we have to demonise PPPs as such, just to identify the major risks involved. And these risks have been well known to the government agencies for a long time. Right back in 2011, a paper that was written for the government by two economists, Liu and Wilkinson, noted that the government here, and I quote, lacks a robust decision-making tool for assisting with choosing alternative procurement methods, and argued that we need a thorough understanding of the drivers and obstacles before we do. And while there's been a little bit of progress in this, and some capabilities being developed at Te Waihanga, largely by employing a couple of guys who have worked in New South Wales, neither the risks nor those obstacles have gone away. And we're proposing to go down the path without having that well-known requirement in place. So there is a strong need. If you think about this country over the next several decades, not just over the next couple of years, there is a need to rebuild that capability, or to build it. It's not solved simply by the creation of new public entities. We've seen the risks of this, for example, in health in my own experience. We're simply setting new principles and objectives and expecting that the existing but reshuffled public resources can deliver them hasn't succeeded. They're not designed for that, they're not trained for that, they have capabilities are not there for that. Now that doesn't mean that you have to defer to the private options, but it means you have to face the reality that we're going to have to build capability and not assume that it exists, and that's one of the reasons why a number of our projects haven't succeeded, that we've assumed capabilities that are not there and not taken the time and effort to rebuild them. In the meantime, I think it's inevitable that political opportunism will overcome and that we'll find that we are going down this track despite the obvious danger. So I've tried, and Craig Rennie's tried to do this quite well, to think a little bit about what sort of things might we agree to. It's no good saying that when nobody can make a private profit off our social infrastructure builds going ahead, we wouldn't get anything built in that because it is all private and they will want to make some profit. So it's a matter of what we do to control that in any systems that we set about doing. And so I think what we have to look to do is to set out a program under which PPPs might be approved, or critically not subject to review and abandonment or cancellation by a future government. So I saw recently a spokesman for the so-called New Zealand Initiative calling out for policy certainty, and I loved this. This was just this week. He said, investors value predictability and stability, especially when it comes to big investments. So an enormous insight, isn't it? Which doesn't exactly cry out for the initiative, innovation and risk-taking, which are so often seen as the virtues of capitalism. But he's not wrong. Big capital does crave certainty, and it wants it provided by governments, ideally. It sees the role of government as being to provide attractive investment projects and to limit or to preferably eliminate the risks involved for them. And so we need to then turn our minds to what sort of things would we say were okay for a great PPP, or to define the areas in which we might, with a future progressive government, and you might think I'm idealistically hopeful, but I am, a future progressive government would change, would turn around and say we're no longer going ahead with that, or would warn ahead of the time that we are not going to agree to projects which you introduce which don't meet our criteria. Craig had a very good go at that. He called it a great PPP list, which I think was very tongue-in-cheek. Now I've expanded on that tongue-in-cheek, and I'm calling it a great PPP. The first one of my great PPPs is priority. We want to have built as priorities the projects which best serve social interests, not those which best fit the investment priorities of the private funders or which most serve private interests. Think about clean water ahead of faster road trips. just for example. So priority, I think we have to define clearly and say what it is. First P. Second P, these crossover cracks a bit, I had a couple. Second P is people. We want projects and processes which are run in such a way as to develop the skills and capabilities of our people for future projects and for other work. If they don't do that, then we don't agree that we will have them. Third P is process. We want processes that recognise full environmental, treaty, employment and community rights. So in other words, fast track is not something that we regard ourselves as bound by. We would say we regard a fast track approval as an illegitimate approval and we won't recognise it, unless of course it did recognise those things. Fourth is pricing. We need to insist that any funding is limited to levels which are consistent with public funding costs. It doesn't make any sense when we're taking risk to allow returns and pricing of these things to be at levels that we could fund ourselves. And finally, protection. We want users in government to be protected from consequences such as repricing or remediation costs or unexpected operational costs from the project which affect its performance. And one of the biggest problems with PPPs around the world has been finding out that subsequently there is a cost that wasn't accounted for, which then turns out to come home. So you need to be sure that we've protected ourselves against those. And I can't see why progressive interests should accept or undertake to respect any arrangements which breach those conditions. They're hardly really onerous or difficult ones, although I'd be prepared to guarantee you there's not a PPP advocate who could find them acceptable, but that will tell you something itself. And to me, if those lists put off potential partners, then so be it. We can do it other ways. There is simple direct delivery or contracting. We do have to build up capability to get to that. It's going to take time for us to do it. It may mean that our infrastructure is less prompt than it might be under PPP arrangements, which could be done more quickly, but that simply means that we've avoided mistakes more quickly. So yes, it might be slow, yes, it might not be perfect, but at least we will have avoided mistakes. So one of the issues I think that we have here is that we don't really frame, this is really the conclusion of what I want to say. One of the issues that we have in dealing with this is that we don't really frame the infrastructure issue itself very well. So if the issue is defined as the absence of infrastructure to support near-term or continuous economic growth on the current exploitative model, then you can understand why these financing and delivery models seem appropriate. If that's what we want to do, if we are going for growth, or ruthlessly, is it remorselessly, I always forget the word the Prime Minister uses, but we're directed towards growth, and by growth he means the ongoing form of exploitative growth that we've grown used to. If that is what you're trying to do, you could see why people would enter into these kind of arrangements. And so we can't live with that framing. But if the infrastructure issue is framed in terms of support for social equity and better living standards, for sustainable and regenerative economic outcomes, then it actually becomes a lot easier to see why private-public partnerships don't serve the interests of what it is we actually want to do anyway. And so I think one of the things we should do is kind of invert this whole thing and think, well, what is this infrastructure problem? Is it that we don't have enough economic growth that mining companies can make money of? Or is it that we want better infrastructure for the living standards and equity and other arrangements that we want? That in itself will determine the kind of way in which you want to undertake to build your infrastructure, and I don't think we will choose PPPs. So I think that's actually, having sort of wandered through some of those financing and other issues, I think the biggest issue for progressives is actually the framing of the issue, and that's where we need to pay attention. So to conclude, when the country's political leadership next changes, and I'm assuming it next changes in a progressive manner, we've got to have another policy bonfire. This time it's got to be a policy bonfire, not of our policies, but of theirs. And we should be clear about what will not stand. No, should they stay or should they go, but hit the road and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, has got to be the message that we're sending. The second clear message, which is as much to ourselves, is rebuild. We've got to rebuild our public, our community, our safe and healthy shared spaces, or these issues of how we finance and build things are already predetermined. We need to be focused on the need to take time and care to specifically rebuild our public capabilities. And that rebuild will feature a different kind of public-private partnership. That'll be one where the public, social and community interest leads. Private enterprise plays a part, but doesn't write the script, doesn't take the lead roles, doesn't direct and produce the whole show and disappear with the profits. That's the difference. And I think that's something that not just should be done together by the progressive parties and those aligned community organisations, but it can only be done that way. And I think that's our real challenge. It's not just to oppose public-private partnerships or to oppose purely private provision of our infrastructure, but it's to lead the rethink of how and why we do these things. Thank you.
Shall I just organise the questions and tell them when to stop? Yeah. Okay, that's good. So, who would like a question? And just speak up. Question. Phil. All right. Okay, excellent. Phil, you might have a question.
One of the most amazing levels of capital investment I think we've ever had in New Zealand has always come from voluntary labour for things that communities want to do amongst themselves, for themselves, by themselves, and get on and do it. And they've achieved an incredibly large structural community edifice out of all of that, from NGOs through to Red Cross and God knows what. And yet they've never become somebody who we regard as a shareholder when it came to decision making of those things. They invariably get to a point where they've become dependent on funding, but whoever that funder was has just said, sorry mate, fund's closed, we're closing you down, you're out of here. And not only do the volunteers get shafted, so does the people who rely on that service. And we go back to square one and we're thinking, let's have a few meetings and get a progressive government back and they'll build it up again and then someone will shaft it. Do you think that we really need to do a lot more about this concept of what is capital and who owns it, and why labour capital is never regarded as sufficient capital to bring into a project?
Yes, I think we do. I think there's a couple of things there. One is we are becoming a bit obsessed with large-scale capital infrastructure. It's not entirely your point, and I'll come to that, but I think it's associated. We tend to think in terms of we've got to build a whole hospital, or we've got to build a whole motorway, or we've got to build a huge solar farm. Whereas in reality, we may be better off building smaller things that communities can actually do and build them up ourselves. So that I think is one. I think we've fallen into not quite giantism, it's a bit silly in the size of our country, but we think about all these projects as being much bigger than they necessarily need to be. And that bedevils how we think about it too. But I think the second point you make is that I agree with, and I don't know how to do this, but we are not building robust community and public organisations. They go through exactly that cycle that you've talked about of enthusiasm. And it's a little bit like the provision of infrastructure. And I think about a lot of these things in the health sector just because I got my mind into it and couldn't get out of it. It's like hospital buildings that are built because someone donated the money. And you have the building, and universities have this too. You have the building, a millionaire puts his name on the front of it, but then the operational costs and what that's dictating in terms of how you operate becomes a charge on the state or on the community or whatever. And it's why I do think that if we did these things at a more, I keep calling it community or social level, it would be a whole lot more lasting because you would take into account all of those things. You need to, when you're building something, seems reasonably obvious, but you need, when you're building something, to take into account how it's going to look. If I give you an example of this, for a few years I was on the board of Precinct Properties, and when a company like Precinct Property builds a big commercial building, it thinks about the costs in terms of the lifetime of the building. And rough rule of thumb, the costs are about the same to build it as the lifetime operational costs of the building. And they think about how they're going to finance both sides of it. That never happens in a government agency or anything of that kind. And we don't think about the operational costs. We don't think about the people that are involved in working in there and have their involvement. But if the people who are involved in it thought about it and were helped to think about it in the right way, they would think about what the financing of their continuing involvement was going to be, not just about the building, not just about the infrastructure that you're putting in place. So I think that how you do it and what you do it with is really important. And I think that is one of the things that building up our own, I think of in terms of building up our own capability and the importance of people and process in that, is that we have to rethink the way we do it. Too often the public agencies that we have now end up building and acting in the same way as a private agency would do because they've bought the idea that somehow that's more efficient. But we should be recognising the real costs. And what a great example we've got of this at the moment, to be a bit discursive, is everyone knew when we passed pay equity legislation that to resolve the pay equity gap was going to cost a lot of money.
Everyone except the Minister of Finance.
Governments denied it for a long period of time. And then suddenly it becomes a big issue that we can't afford this thing. Now, instead of thinking at the time, how are we going to achieve the shift from an unjust set of pay scales in terms of gender equity? How are we going to do that? What's the transition path? Where are the costs going to be? Where's it going to fall over? What time? How are we going to resolve it? Instead of thinking about all those, we did it in that kind of very narrow way. And one of the things about rebuilding public capability and why I refer to it as safe shared place is that we need to build those things into what we think of as infrastructure. We need to think about in terms of their continuity. And I am impressed, and I know it's trite to do it, I'm sorry this is a long-winded answer, but it is trite to do it. But when you see some of the projects, not all of them, but many of the projects that have been developed by iwi organisations, they do think about those things. They do think about the continuity. They do build those kind of things into how they think about it. And I think it's a big lesson for us to learn from that.
That's a different worldview, isn't it, Rob?
Question?
Sorry, I was just saying that that's a different worldview that we have. And in fact, actually, that's part of the problem that we have with our current framing, as you've described it, is it's a worldview that is predicated on a whole lot of a different belief system.
Yeah, well, I mean, their culture's different. I mean, enclosures happened for us centuries ago, and for Māori it happened relatively recently, so the separation out hasn't been as effective on their mindset as it's been on most of ours.
Transmission Gully was talked about, about 50 or 60 years ago when I was a little girl. And I used to think, oh God, that'd be amazing. And so nothing happened and nothing happened and nothing happened. And then a public-private partnership came along and suddenly something happened. It was a total disaster. I don't know that it actually did work, but we've got Transmission Gully now.
Yeah, we've got it, but is it the right thing to get? Would we have been better to use that money to build a public transport network rather than a motorway network based around? I think that's probably right, but I don't.
Go along that little railway line right by the sea and that tiny little road. That's the problem. Is that Pukurua Bay, Paikatariki?
Yeah.
We live in Kapiti, we live in Waitanai, and
Speak up.
we live in Waitanai. And one of the things that's confused me is that Transmission Gully has made a huge difference to the lives of people living up in Kapiti in relation to Wellington. So I would prefer it had been done by government, that whole thing, with more this problem before and it got done when somebody came in and decided that they were going to get on and do it. And whether it was done by a public-private partnership or otherwise, I don't think anybody in Capita cared at the end, as long as it got there. And that's one of the problems about persuading people, I suppose, about, you know, how you do things, because by the time, it had been so many years in the coming, that by the time it got there, literally nobody cared what way it was delivered. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, I hear you, and I've got a stepdaughter and a whānau who live up that way too, and she would argue the same thing with me. But I mean, what we did was we allowed or encouraged expansion of where people lived around a corridor that was very inaccessible, really.
Yeah.
And then it became that the only real answer to that probably was to build a motorway, and then the only real way to do that was through some kind of PPP arrangement. So each decision we make is really important, which is why I go back to my framing thing. You can't allow it to be reduced to how do we do this particular project when, I think of it as the ferries as well. You know, there's a huge problem with whatever you put on. You can get cheaper ferries, but if they're doing it for freight, the road between Picton and Otatahi has no way of carrying the freight that you can carry across in the ferries. And so nobody's addressing that issue at the moment. You've got to see these things in their whole. And the danger for us, I think, from the progressive side of things, is if we allow it. Some things we're committed to. You can't just turn back history. I understand that. But we've got to think about all of these projects in terms of their holistic effect, rather than as individual projects, because as individual projects, they just become technical issues, and that just endlessly repeats itself. So, I think in an ideal world, you probably wouldn't have had the type of expansion of population that you've had up the Kapiti coast. You wouldn't have had. You might have actually directed something towards what more facilities were made available there in terms of work. There are different ways you'd have thought about that in terms of development if you weren't intent on just repeating what we do now. Because, a lot of those people have now got a good way to drive into Wellington to attend their public service job if it was still there.
The Transmission Gully thing is quite interesting because my dad was very involved as a city councillor and he headed up the Parramatta Residents Association. So I grew up all down there, all through years and years of that. And I think the Transmission Gully thing was interesting because when it was eventually, when it was eventually priced up, the price that they originally proposed it at, which I think was about $550 million, it ended up being over $1 billion, I think. But the original price would have built a 2-lane clearway all the way around where you're talking about, Goat Point and all the way up there. 2-lane clearway which would have avoided all of Mare Esplanade. And in addition to that, the money left over would have funded free public transport for the Wellington region basically perpetually. So the amount of money that was spent on Transmission Gully was monstrously larger than what could have been spent to effectively achieve the same sort of thing. And admittedly, it would have been along that area, there might have been earthquake risks, there were reasons for it to happen. But the amount of money that was spent was hugely excessive, largely on the basis of, as you pointed out, there's a private company and they're trying to extract a profit, and they can't extract profit from people riding trains. I do think that there is a lot of those sorts of factors in there as well, that the Transmission Gully is an interesting case.
Yeah, don't argue with that. And if you think that's a problem, you wait till we get further steps along the way of the motorway going north.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe you can explain to me why New Zealand has $12 billion to put into the Defence Capability Bill. The Defence Capability Plan has allocated $12 billion taxpayer dollars to all the military infrastructure needed to be interoperable and increase lethality and force multiplier and interoperable with America service and that the government is supposed to be responsible for. But when it comes to militarism and defense, we're allowed to expand as much as possible. And how does that work with public-private partnerships?
Well, there'll be a lot of private money made out of that whole process. Not much will be made in New Zealand either, but look, there's no adequate answer to that, is there? Except I would say this, I think that the reasons that that is being done are to do with the geopolitical shifts that are going on and the desire to line up more with our new friend India and with Australia and the UK and the USA, those forms of alliance, and what we need to do. We don't have, when you think about that free trade agreement with India, what do we have to give India that India wants? Nothing. Nothing. But geopolitically, we are quite important to that. So there's those are the reasons that we're there. The reasons that we're having, trade discussions, and we're now intensely friendly with Vietnam, is primarily to do with the private investment interests that are flowing in that region and in a geopolitical sense. So I think it's much more political than anything to do with defence. I think the defence spend is just what we're using to kowtow, and it's a crime, utter crime.
I've been told to catch up with questions, but Robert, if you want to ask a question.
Well, no, I mean, if there were
If
questions.
people are asking, should we just keep going for a wee while longer?
Sure.
Well, Robert.
Okay. Just a quick little point that, and then a question. About a dozen years ago, the old Mayor Brown, not the new Mayor Brown, put me on a group which was looking at alternative funding for Auckland Transport. I was a token trade union people along with a whole lot of other people. Now, I thought I would be sort of the lone voice. And one of the other was a young merchant banker who had come back from the UK and was offered his services for that as well. And when PPPs came up, and I spoke against, and other people were speaking for, came to his turn, and he said, who am I here on behalf of? Am I working for you as the council? Do you want the view of what's best for the council, or do you want a view of what's best for the people that I used to work for? And they said, no, the council. Don't touch PPPs with a barge pole. He said, when I go back to work, I'll still be pushing for them. But, and so, it just shows your initial point that you can't not believe in them because they exist, but in whose interests really do they exist?
It's a very good point. I mean, my views are not purely ideological. I worked on the PPP, which was led by Macquarie, building Thames Water in the UK. So I saw all of the documents leading up to it. It was perfectly obvious that it would never work for the people of London that it was servicing. It was perfectly obvious that the exit was to refinance and get the money out, load it up with debt, and then leave the people with the problem, and that's exactly what's happened. So, and then subsequently I was involved with, closely involved with the development of the desalination plant as a PPP in Melbourne, which was hugely expensive, but was driven primarily by the French company Suez as an alternative to the, they had some problems with the Murray River, still do have some problems with the Murray River and its water supply, but it was hugely expensive. And again, the effort that was put in and the level of skill that was put into de-risking that project for Suez and for the private investors, again our friends from Macquarie were closely involved, it was entirely what the negotiations were about. So when I'm using actual examples I know about, that where that asymmetry of capability has been so dominant, and the strength of the demands of capital get out of that do overcome the social. So yeah, it's very real, Rob, and I'm not surprised that merchant banker, I mean, one of the earliest lessons I learned, a very quick anecdote from getting involved a little bit in the investment banking world, was criticising a likely outcome of a completely different project, and the leader of it, who was an American guy, said, Rob, it's the old investment banking motto, YNH, INH, YNH. I'm not here, you're not here. And that was very cynical, but was exactly how they thought about it.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Given all of our super funds and more money going into that, it seems in some ways that PPPs have come on the agenda while there is so much capital washing around the world. Is that a sort of an issue which
There is.
the inverse thing to super funds which generally we support, but if they're spending all their time doing exactly what capital has to do.
Yeah, and they quickly turn from your friend into your enemy. They're your friend when you're thinking about how your KiwiSaver account or your government super account is going. But when they start investing in you, they have the same requirements of capital that everyone else has. So, and all around the world, there is an enormous amount of capital sloshing around looking for alternatives. And that's what's driving this. I mean, the government's always...
Our forests.
Yeah, so that's just it's probably what you'd call a contradiction, I think, Rob.
Maybe it's something for you to think about later, Rob. But we've talked about sort of infrastructure in the public-private world, sort of bricks and mortar and things like that. But when it comes to intellectual property, it would be interesting to put that in the frame and think about how that works, because an enormous amount of intellectual property is generated within the public sector. Some of that, very little of that, is actually monetized for the direct benefit of the public sector. It's usually monetized by private interests. And there are some really fine examples of where that has come back to the public sector through because of the ethos of those companies, and Fisher Buckle Healthcare is an example of that. But it would be interesting just to turn our minds, perhaps your mind, maybe over coffee, to that issue, because it is a potentially valuable one, largely because of what we generate here, which is an enormous amount of intellectual property.
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue, but it's quite a long cup of coffee, because I actually think the whole concept of intellectual property is now under challenge. I think capitalism needed intellectual property as a concept for the enclosing knowledge, as they started off enclosing farms. And I think the dominant forms of capital now no longer need that. In fact, see it as an obstacle to further accumulation. Now, I think we're going to lose intellectual property for whatever matters. AI, for example, the AI, the large learning models have learned of everything that is stored. They've nicked it. It's gone already.
Right, thank you. There's so much that you've talked about, and it feels to me as if we could talk about this for quite a long time. The things that I've taken away from this are your PPPs that need to be looked at more in terms of policy development and things. And I guess my fear is that it's very difficult often to grab the attention of the people who make the decisions long enough to get them to really delve into some of these issues to the extent that we need them to be able to make those decisions in the long run.
It's hard to do under urgency.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, indeed. And I guess in Fabian's we've also discussed quite a lot in the past this idea of trying to rebuild into the public sector some capability for some of these things, and that will no doubt grow, and I think there's something to be published to about some of the talks that we've given on those sorts of issues. But thank you. I think this is probably the only start of a conversation which will continue on